So as we know, the COP is happening in Brazil this year from November 10th to the 21st, and it marks a very critical moment as we've been discussing a lot on why COPs are even relevant. This one is a little bit more relevant in the way that the last time a climate event happened in Brazil was in 1992 with the Earth Summit that kind of shaped the UNFCCC. And that's now after 25 years. Again, we're witnessing a very critical climate meeting happening in Belém in the Amazon rainforest. And it kind of sets up a few important agenda points on the table. It is also being looked at more as an implementation COP because there's been a lot of discussions on what priorities are, how we should go forward with things. And the idea that this presidency is looking at it is more on like what you can actually do with the NDCs. It's also pivotal because it marks almost the halfway junction from Paris in 2015 to 2030 and all the priorities. So the NDCs are going to be redeveloped and rehashed, and every country has the opportunity to kind of put forward the revised NDCs, also discuss what all they have done in the past few years and put all of that forward. So why is this important for India? In this COP is being, again, like I said, pushed as more of an adaptation, resilience, justice, equity, fairness, implementation COP. And these are all very much in line with what India's priorities are and how India has been pushing itself and marketing itself almost as a leader of the global south, keeping in mind all of these ideas and agenda points. So first, like it is also a climate adaptation COP. We have seen our country being ravaged a lot by floods, crop loss, coastal issues. And I think adaptation has been a key issue that India has been focusing on, trying to push that building resilience is as important as cutting down emissions. And I think given that this is a COP that's happening in the global south is different from what Baku was last year and how things were in COP28 as well when it was in the Middle East. So the focus of this COP is a little different, and India has more of space, I think, to take on more of a leadership role, which is very much in line with what it's focusing on. It also is looking at how climate finance systems and frameworks can be changed and mobilized to increase investment flows. I think that has been a key issue. We've seen a lot of discussions around this in the past as well. And we at CSEP have also been looking at it through different lenses, looking at how climate finance can be mobilized. My team here is also looking at how you can maybe look at different sectors. Is it only MDBs that have to be reformed? Are there any avenues to get private sector capital coming into climate? Can you look for more innovative mechanisms as debt to climate swaps, something like that? So I think all of those are, again, points that India will be pushing. And again, like I said, it is justice and equity that have been on the focus for India, looking at how you can support more green jobs, protect vulnerable communities, and ensuring that in the transition and green development, nobody is left behind. And again, so this is an opportunity for India to kind of reframe its NDCs, talk about what has happened, because we know that India is one of the few countries that has actually kept up with the promises that had made at Paris and how it can perhaps also push for that. And we've had this whole discussion of India wanting to host and organize COP33. So that is another point that we'll be discussing. So just to introduce the panelists, this is Dr. Constantino Xavier. He leads the foreign policy team at CSEP, and he is looking a lot at how climate finance institutions and frameworks can be not changed, but how India can be more present in these policy circles, how it can improve its representation in different formats, how it can perhaps enhance its voice a little bit more and get countries together. Dr. Veda Vaidyanathan here is an expert on Africa. She looks at India's foreign policy in Africa, has been doing a lot of work on critical minerals and how India and Africa can cooperate to ensure access to these minerals, and has also been to Africa a lot of times, has visited the fields. So I think her perspectives on justice, equity in the mining sector, how it actually happens and the downstream will be really important. And here, Dr. Pooja Ramamurthi leads the climate diplomacy work under the foreign policy team. She's been looking at energy transitions, triangular cooperation, which is again a very relatively more innovative model of how the global north and global south can cooperate to bridge climate action and promote more sustainable architectures. And at CSEP, we also, climate is something that is very well embedded in all the work that we do. So it's not only, so the foreign policy team looks at more than just diplomacy, looks at climate diplomacy, but everybody else in CSEP also looks at it. We have teams working on climate finance, specifically on taxonomy. We look at climate and health and how that has an impact. We look at specifically on mining and minerals. Responsible mining is something that we're trying to look at now a little bit more. So all of this is very much in alignment with what India's priorities are. And so we're really glad you chose to come to CSEP to kind of understand what our India's priority is going to be as we go ahead at Belém. So with that, I would like to start just asking questions to the panelists, if that's okay. And then after the questions, we'll open it up a little bit for Q&A. And so the first question I would like to ask Dr. Xavier, if that's okay, on climate finance, because that is one of the key issues we've seen come around at multiple discussions and debates. And as we know, one of the key focuses is how you can actually bridge this issue of the pledges that countries have made to real world action, and how you can actually enhance the equity and accessibility for climate finance, and how you can perhaps have more resilience focused finance as opposed to others. And the work that you have done with my colleague Abhinand and as well Nirja, you've looked at how this has not actually happened, how perhaps India is a little bit less represented in a lot of these forums, not a part of a lot of the conversations. So how do you think India can actually advocate for the reforms of these multilateral institutions first? And perhaps what are the newer mechanisms that India is looking to maybe work on or can build on to have more access to finance?
Thanks, Anindita. So good to be here and have a discussion on such a timely issue. I was talking to my German friend just now, and I think everyone is fishing for the news, what might happen over the next few weeks in Brazil. Different accounts. I think we're all a bit puzzled whether a lot will happen, very little. I think a lot of anxiety in terms of classifying this COP before even it has happened. I think let's hold on. I think there's good news and bad news in both. That's my bottom line. And I'll try to explain a little bit what Anindita is prompting me to do, why I see that particularly in the Indian position. The current study that you mentioned is on institutional capacity regarding climate finance. This is a theme that runs deep across the foreign policy team that is here and beyond, in this room and beyond, which is, you can have all the voice in the world, you can speak louder, softly, but you need the brains and the muscle to negotiate, to find technocratic solutions. You need a strong research ecosystem at home. You need a strong state capacity, and state in its many avatars. That means different ministries. That means coordination. That's also a form of capacity. That means communication. It means central and state. So that means also below the national, the subnational, regional state governments are important players today. This also means, by the way, coordination between central government, the central government in its many forms, and the industry. And the private sector, which are essential players today in India's decarbonization strategy. So with that longer, broader song, I leave it at that. I'll come to later on the capacity issue, which is really what we look at in our team on many issues where India is engaging abroad, right? It needs stronger capacity, strategies, systems, institutions, research ecosystems to be able to pursue its very important and justified interests in a very competitive and fragmenting world. And here in climate, I think you all agree that the world is looking quite dire and difficult compared to two, three years ago, and certainly 15 years ago. So that is all the more important that if India wishes to continue to be a player and pursue its interests, and I think the signals are clear. If you look what the Prime Minister, different governments, different decision makers in India are saying, even post-Trump election, the commitment is there. The continuity is there, but in a more adverse environment, therefore, the issue of capacity that we have been studying for a long time in this team becomes even more urgent. So on the climate finance in particular, the study we're doing with Abhinand, who's sitting over there, and Nirja Kulkarni, makes basically an audit of capacity on climate finance. And It speaks to a lot of the work that we're doing across CSEP and other colleagues. Montek Ahluwalia, Utkarsh Patel, Rakesh Mohan, Janak Raj. All these colleagues have been, in many ways, making two cases. One, an assessment of the quantitative needs of what climate finance is and India needs. So I'll spare you the billions and trillions and the numbers. Fix any number you wish in your mind. It is a certain number that they are assessing. The studies are out there. And they're assessing how much of this can come or not from the multilateral development banks as they exist today. Okay. And of course, making the case for reform of those traditional 75 years, 50 plus old institutions. The 3 points I want to make is that one, and I hope this is my first proposition, I think clearly across colleagues at CSEP, I think we all agree, though we don't have an institutional position, but I sense all my colleagues would buy into this statement that the MDBs will not be able to cater to the demand that India needs. Okay, there's just no supply coming. There will be some supply, but it will be a trickle of a supply given the magnitude of what India needs. Two, another proposition that we all, I think, agree on is that the MDBs as they exist, even less, but even reformed MDBs would be limited in their capacity. And all the more, the chances of reform are very, very limited. Okay. Why? We can go down that drain, but I'll spare you the long story. Structural issues, institutional failure, geopolitical change, the US opting out, obviously, again, and as a prime player, undermining those international institutions that it was pioneering in its creation 75 years ago. I don't know if some of you saw the fantastic interview that Professor James Robinson, the Nobel laureate, gave to the Mint, I think 2 days ago, where he actually says that Trump is a manifestation, a response to institutional failure. He's also destroying institutions, but he is more than that, a response to institutional decay in the US. I would propose that on climate, we're seeing institutional failure, international institutional failure in many accounts of institutions that we took for granted that performed, but are severely limited and are failing. And we are about to see what comes out of that, whether it's a risk or an opportunity, depends on your perspective. I think both are there. So if that's the failure, and if everyone is doing whatever they wish and feel voluntary inclined to do. Rahul Tongia, my colleague, keeps saying this, that no climate action will happen until this is, voluntary and nice things to do. You can opt in, opt out as you feel. If that's the case, where's hope? Okay, 3 points on climate finance. I'll just make these 3 points before passing the word. One, I think beyond the extremes of COP is amazing, COP is the end of COP. There is, in what we've done in our studies, a suggestion that COP can transform its role. Now, we think of the Conference of Parties, 198 parties, right, that are meeting every year. That will grow. But the role of COP as a site of action, I think, will be taking a backseat as a site of thinking about critical decisions of action on decarbonization, whether it's climate finance in particular, is limited and is actually decaying. Now, the COP as a site of consultations, what do you call a political forum, of sharing best practices, experiences, pushing some things, obviously, not just sharing, etc. I think we'll see more of that. And we'll see this, I think COP in Belém will mark that tipping point. We saw indications of this before in Baku, but I think now, for many reasons, including a new president in the US and 5 major economies not being there, leaders. We don't have China there, we don't have India there, we don't have Russia there, we don't have the US there, and at the leader's position, I think will accelerate that change. So I think President Lula calls it this old Aboriginal concept of mutirão in Portuguese. Mutirão is, I think, maybe something like mela or conclave, and I think that's, what he's saying. He's onto something. He's trying to make a weakness into a strength, into a new model for the COP. And I think that, at least in our report 3 years ago, we actually proposed, predicted, and actually India in many ways has been an advocate of this. So expect in that sense a more moderate India, more engaging India compared to Baku for sure, I think. And that's a format that India generally is more comfortable with. If you look at the COPs in the 90s and 2000s, it was a very different architecture that India was traditionally less comfortable. Point 2. Second line, silver lining of hope, is focus more on sectoral geographic bodies. We call them sometimes in our IR jargon minilaterals, sector-specific clubs. India again has been at the forefront of this with the ISA, the CDRI. We'll give you a separate example of the ones we have studied that we are studying in this current report, which is the Network for the Greening the Financial System, which is a collective of central banks around the world that are meeting now. I think it's 2017 now existence, so getting close to 10 years. Those are systems that I think are going to be in their regulatory power, in their engagement on the norms that are going to regulate climate flows with a green element, critical. And here the story is mixed. India only joined in 2021, 4 years late. It's a late entrant. And I think there are lessons to that. And we argue that in our paper that there are important lessons that India cannot afford to miss these buses. It should have been at the start of the NGFS. And our scoping assessment of the NGFS is India is absent of most working groups today, right? Smaller central banks of smaller countries have played a very disproportionately important role from Africa, from South America, from Southeast Asia, when India was not even part of the NGFS. So it's a late entrant, and those have huge costs. You're not part of the cockpit, basically. China, not surprisingly, was a founding member and isn't part of the top steering committee. So the RBI has dialed in now, is part of it. It hosted the plenary in 2025. It developed its own initial systems. But I think here, number one, I think there's hope in these frameworks where India is starting to join. It's late, but I would watch out very closely to these, in addition to our focus on the COP. That's at least what we argue. And it's also because the importance of playing ball in these international frameworks means joining them, and not just joining them for the sake, but also developing, once again, the capacity to be present in the rooms, the technocratic, the expertise ability to be what in diplomatic jargon we call a demandeur, someone who puts forward positions, initiatives. That is commensurate with India's demographic, economic, and of course, climate action power. Last point of hope maybe is the private sector. This is something we've been studying too. If you look at the Paris asset owners, right, the various conglomerates of industries, right, whether it's the hard to abate industries, but any types of industries who are beginning to consult, club up, think, develop their own standards. And then you look at those clubs, for example, there's several of these, but for example, the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change that we've been engaging with or studying, the AIGCC. If you look at the AIGCC, which is an Asia-centric asset owners club, it's engaged hardcore with China and with Japan, two very developed engagements. Engagement with India remains at zero. And not because of their fault. I mean, they've been trying very hard. So I think it's just a small example I give you on why there is a lot of hope, I think, on India and what you can be doing beyond our COP focus, etc., of engaging with the private sector in setting, certain standards. Here again, the work that we're doing at CSEP, Lavish, a few other colleagues on CBAM, for example, and the costs, right, of CBAM for the Indian economy, lines up very interestingly with what industry wants, is concerned about, Indian industry concerns too, of course. But bringing the private sector to those discussions, I think, is therefore essential and will, I think, prove very productive for India's climate action, whether generate climate finance incoming in any way possible, way beyond our focus on the old public global north sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Tino. I think, like you said, the platforms for actions are shifting, and I think COP serves as a platform where a lot of other countries can come together, have discussions, like you said, push for more regulatory aspects of things, have more convenings, have more discussions, and the actual, perhaps, action is going to come from a lot of these smaller rooms, and that's why it's more important to be in those smaller rooms. And like you also mentioned, having more sector-specific focuses and would perhaps be helpful for COP, focusing more on regional groupings and actually having more tangible action come out of that. And on that note, I would just like to then go on to Dr. Veda Vaidyanathan, who has been looking at critical minerals in Africa. And like we know, many of my colleagues are doing work on critical minerals. Professor Chadda has been looking at this and his team since 2019. Looking at how India needs them, projecting domestic demand. So we've been one of the key institutions looking at this for a while. So just on that, we realize these are important, essential components for not only clean energies, but a lot of other sectors, be it defense, pharmaceuticals, So the actual importance of these kind of spans multiple things. But when it comes to accessing them, there's supply chain issues, which is again an angle that has been discussed a lot. But one of the focuses of this COP, at least, has been on how you can actually have more equal access and also make sure that the environmental risks are curbed to the least. So on that front, you have been to Zimbabwe, where a lot of the mining actually happens. You've seen what the communities are like, what the repercussions of mining kind of are, the social impacts of it. I think my teammates here had also recently just gone to Orissa to look at what the mining sector is like there and how that kind of has an impact. So I'd be happy to hear from you later in the Q&A as well. So just on that, I would like to know, how do you think India is positioning itself or should position itself to foster more sustainable, fair, resilient supply chains for critical minerals with the Global South focus as the front?
Pooja. Thank you, Anindita, for that question. And thank you, Pooja, for bringing us all in this room and for what is the word? Co-opting me into the climate space. Just before I answer Anindita's question, there's a very interesting shift that's been happening in the 2020s in the last 4-5 years. One in which governments are increasingly starting to link industrial policy, climate goals, and resource security. What that has done is that there's a tension that's emerging, like Anindita mentioned. One about supply chain security, issues of supply chain securitization, and on the other hand, supply chain justice. Now, this is shifting academic discourse, but it's also shifting the lens on how we view this issue of critical minerals. Because the question is moving from how do we access these minerals, which are so crucial for our industrial growth and our defense sectors and so on, to how is that access secured? Who benefits from this? Who bears the risk? Who bears the costs? How do we make sure that mining communities who are in the forefront of this are not marginalized and that they are empowered? For example, in September this year, the African Climate Summit brought together a lot of heads of state. And one of the things that got a lot of attention was this idea of a just mineral supply chain. And two things stood out for me reading the joint statements and the things that came out. One was this idea that Tino mentioned also of internal state capacity, right? How do producer countries not just be bystanders in this global conversation, and how do they actually become co-architects of this conversation? And second, in specific to the African case and perhaps Latin America as well, how can these smaller countries come together to increase their collective bargaining power and their collective negotiation power, especially in this conversation about a mineral-led industrialization? So at COP now, we see that 200 odd civil society organizations have come together, and they've urged parties to put transition minerals and mining communities at the heart of climate negotiations. And they've even proposed a mechanism, a Belém action mechanism, to accelerate, consolidate, and achieve a more just transition. And in this larger global discourse, I think India is very uniquely placed to really substantially contribute. One, of course, it's the commerce of it, right? It's a rapidly growing clean energy market. Then there's the climate politics of it, how it's historically argued for more equity, but also the fact that India has really rich partnerships with several global South countries. It's part of the India-Africa critical minerals work that we do here, just that critical minerals cooperation doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's the result of decades and centuries of economic and political relations, and then earlier on in the century, how resource diplomacy became a critical part. Hydrocarbons, for instance, was a huge part of the India-Africa conversation, and now we're talking about critical minerals. And then also how the domestic critical mineral system, the ecosystem in India has been growing. You have the National Critical Mineral Mission, but you also have India as part of something like the MSP, the only developing country that's part of MSP. So there's a very dynamic conversation internally in the country about how we can actually add value to a lot of these dialogues. So I think to the question of what can India do, one is to champion responsible mineral governance. a lot of the local conferences and conversations that I'm part of in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Kenya, a big part of the conversation is about how do we get these actors who are coming into our countries for resources, how do we actually get them to act more responsibly? And as you know, we don't really need to get into the nitty-gritties of it, but the politics of critical mineral supply chains is also skewed in particular countries' favor, and therefore a lot of the producer countries want to diversify partnerships. So now what is India's value proposition to this? How can India bring value to this conversation and create frameworks, perhaps model a responsible mineral diplomacy or a responsible mining charter? Again, these frameworks already exist. For instance, India has MOUs signed with 15, 16 African producer countries to include another appendix on responsible mining would not be too far-fetched. It's something that we can actually work towards. And second, also, again, Tino mentioned the ISA. So perhaps something along the lines of a Global South framework for sustainable critical minerals. Because one of the things, again, that I've gained from in the last 2 years of starting to work on this is that there are several think tanks and research institutes across the Global South asking very similar questions. So there is a lot of room for knowledge sharing. There's a lot of room for experience sharing, and actually helping curate and imagine what critical minerals, not just as a commodity, but actually as a framework of equity could look like. So I think those are two specific.
No, thank you so much. And I think that also ties in very well into just the agendas and focus points that the UN has. I think the UN itself has a panel on transition minerals that focuses primarily on justice and equity. And they came out with a report 2 years ago. And I think they're trying to now actually operationalize that and come out with a second report, which I'm assuming is going to be coming out soon. And I think because of that focus and the whole idea of responsible mining, I think this is coming across there's an intergovernmental panel also on it, which looks primarily at how supply chains can be more sustainable. And just taking on from all of the discussions that we've had, we've seen these newer frontiers kind of develop, fields that are a little bit more dynamic. We've seen traditional platforms, partnerships kind of take a back seat with new innovative models come across. And my colleague, Dr. Pooja Ramamurthi, has been looking at one of these very innovative frameworks called triangular cooperation, which has been technically in practice for quite some time, but I think the model has kind of gained more recognition. And that is, again, something that is going to be coming across at this COP with the Global South and Global North coming together to bridge a lot of climate action issues, bringing more innovation into it, and also making sure that these innovations that do come to countries allow for vulnerable communities to not feel that excluded from the whole climate action. So just on that, Pooja, I would like to ask you, how do you think this framework of triangular cooperation can be scaled and perhaps even institutionalized at maybe like a platform like COP? And would COP30, do you feel like it would be something that would maybe focus on this? And how do you think India can maybe take on a more leadership role, because it's been one of the key driving partners in a lot of these partnerships and this model of cooperation? So do you think and there's anything that India can actually bring to the table when it comes to this?
This is okay. Yeah. So, I mean, as Anindita said, this concept of triangular cooperation, and I'm not sure everyone in the room would have heard this very technical term, but it's very simple. It's essentially two countries in the developing world kind of having knowledge exchange or technical exchange, but which is then supported by maybe a multilateral agency or by a country in the global north. But and as Anindita said, it's not a new concept. It has been around since the 1960s, 70s. India itself in the region has been quite a good triangular partner, working in, for example, working on telecommunications in Nepal with the support of the US. But this paper actually, I mean, this idea emerged when I was doing my PhD, and at that time, my advisor said, okay, but if we're thinking of global governance of climate change, and it is in such a north-south gridlock, then is there some way in which we can break these narratives of that COP has now become so enveloped by just a global north versus global South. And, often when you go to meetings, they even say, oh, like, people from the global South are becoming quite hostile, because the global North is not taking in like enough action. But I don't see that changing anytime soon, because we see, I mean, with, as Tino mentioned, Donald Trump, but it's not only Donald Trump. Even if you see more progressive countries in Europe, for example, the climate agenda is not the priority now, or there's actually pushback towards the climate agenda, right? I mean, you even have your Mark Carneys, who are the moderates, who are actually, not pushing the climate agenda as far as I think 10 years ago, maybe the Green candidates would. So I don't see this changing. So then what do we do? I mean, how do we then move forward and not let the COP become just this battleground, but actually become a space of productivity? And as Anindita says, then you need to start looking at alternate paradigms. Now, I'm not one to say that, this means all responsibility of the global North needs to go away, because we do need, and India has been one of the countries from the start who has been pushing for this paradigm of climate justice and historical emissions. But if you then have this conundrum of how to break away from global North-South gridlocks, but at the same time to make sure that there are alternate paradigms within the fact that still there is some kind of tech transfer and knowledge transfer happening from the global North, then I think this idea of triangular cooperation really fits into the COP framework itself. It helps to reframe and readjust it within the COP. And I think now is the time for this, especially because why? Because Belém is going to be a COP of implementation. So I think there's a feeling that, okay, all the blah, blah, blah is over now. All the frameworks have been put into place. All the UNSFC articles have now been kind of ratified. There has been a lot of, there has been kind of an understanding that this is where we are and this is what we're going to do. But there's been no understanding of how, right? Like, and I think a lot of countries, especially in the global South, are getting tired and they're like, okay, how? Because I think countries in the global South, especially in, a lot of the landlocked mountain ones and the large ocean states, they're like, okay, we're actually starting to feel now some of the consequences of climate change. And so then how are we going to either mitigate it, or how are we going to become resilient? And I think that's where triangular cooperation actually has the biggest role to play, because I don't think countries in the global South can blindly copy models of climate governance from the global North. And I don't think that is something that will be successful. Rather, what I think will be most successful is this South-South exchange. So there are a lot of very good models from all around the global South on how to really put out large-scale, affordable climate mitigation and adaptation solutions. But again, considering as Tino said, a lot of the capacity problems, our state capacity is not that good, our institutional structures, we don't have as strong networks, I mean, if you take our German colleagues, they have GIZ, they have very strong grassroots offices. So we don't have those kind of networks and capacity and institutional mandates as well in order to actually engage so closely with vulnerable communities in the global South. Like another thing my Fiji colleagues were telling me at the Fiji High Commission was, we are such a small country, and then if we need to do so many engagement with multiple global South countries, it becomes really hard. We just don't have the institutional capacity. Whereas if there was some way in which we could actually gain from other countries in the global South through the existing, maybe the COP framework or the UNDP, that would become much easier for us than doing individual bilaterals with other South-South countries. So, so now is the time to start institutionalizing this into COP. I mean, how that could functionally look was you could create a program, you could create a smaller fund, and it doesn't have to be very large scale, because to be honest, triangular cooperation, at least, I mean, so in Latin America, it is quite established and strong, but in the rest of the world, it is quite learning by doing at the moment, right? So you can just create some kind of pilot funds within COP. You can create a fund or a program which encourages exploring, piloting, and then scaling up lessons from these triangular engagements. And it doesn't have to always be traditional partners. You have the newer partners such as the Gulf Cooperation Council. They are actually putting a lot of funding into money in and innovation. So I think that could be one way of institutionalizing it at COP, but then also changing the narrative beyond these north-south gridlocks, and kind of saying that, because also the north-south gridlock is a pretty one where it says that all tech transfer has to come from global north to the south. I mean, to be honest, I mean, look at the case of India's energy efficiency schemes, of India's rollout of renewable energy, of India's heat action plans. There is a lot to learn. It's not that we always have to be passive recipients and be like, oh, please, we just need all this tech and knowledge. No, I think we have a lot that we can give the world. But unfortunately, as Tino said, our state capacity to share that with the world is not as good, I think, at the moment, as could be by leveraging triangular partnerships. And we have started to, for example, India and the UNDP have this triangular fund where actually 70% of the 80 plus projects are on climate and energy. So you can see there that climate and energy is already a top priority for India. It is starting to engage. But it's just that I think, as I said, there needs to be within the COP framework more acknowledgement of this. There have been out of the box approaches. I think this was also mentioned, the International Solar Alliance, the CDRI, now the Biofuel Alliance. These are also what we would call triangular platforms, because these were not started individually by India, but started with partner countries such as France. But again, how do you then merge the ISA's objectives within COP? I mean, of course, ISA has a pavilion every time at COP, but how do you synergize them? I think that needs to be done. Again, I think this can come with, the COP having a forum where triangular experiences need to be showcased and learned from. And then I think another thing is that you see that, specifically coming to India, I think climate and energy approaches and sharing that knowledge with the world has been a top priority for India. If you see its triangular engagements with Germany, UK, France, all of them have mentioned, some kind of climate or clean energy goals. And one might ask why? Why? Because that's the demand of the global south. They especially, as I said, the most vulnerable communities, that is the demand. They need cost-effective climate solutions which are suitable for their cultural context. But what can we learn, which can be then, what can we learn from the Indian experience, which can be then put into the COP framework? I think one is really essential, is that we need a need-based approach, right? So I think one thing that we see from triangular cooperation is that it has been a very needs-based approach, where you really understand, okay, so I have these Pacific islands, they need early warning systems. So, how do we meet that need? As opposed to top down kind of coming and telling them what they need to do. Grassroots level needs, when we think about innovation and tech, it doesn't always need to be Chat GPT or DeepSeek. It can actually be grassroots innovation. And that's something I repeatedly keep saying, is that India is actually really, really good at that. We went to an India-China climate diplomacy conference, and we honestly, and the Chinese themselves said, one thing that we really admire about India is that you have this grassroots entrepreneurship, and you have this grassroots tech and innovation, and we would like to learn that. I mean, there's not many things that China needs to learn from us about climate change and tech, because they are way ahead. But I think this is actually one of our strengths, and something that I feel that we need to then start speaking about more at COP, and kind of building these networks, as Veda said, these networks of actors who work on these things at the grassroots levels, and how to engage these local actors across multiple scales. And then I think another thing that I really liked about the triangular approach, which the UK and France tried, which hasn't taken up, but if it does take up, I think it would have a lot of scale, is actually seed funding or grants for these grassroots entrepreneurs so that they can then expand their markets into other global south countries. So, if we take, there is, for example, this fantastic company that uses artificial intelligence to predict weather patterns and then shares that information with smallholder farmers, right? So you're using AI. But again, I said it doesn't have to be very large scale. It's a very impactful way of actually using AI for something, for climate resilience. So these examples which India has, it needs to showcase at COP, but also say that COP can be about this kind of community engagement. I think with that, I will stop. Yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, Pooja, you gave us some very tangible and actionable things that are already happening. And I think one of the key takeaways I found from each of your points has been that this is a COP for Global South leadership, and India is very well positioned to actually take up the mantle, kind of do a little bit more than what it has previously been perhaps labeled as not doing. And just on that note, I mean, this is the last question I have for all of you, and I would like to maybe have 2 or 3 points that you could perhaps give, some strategic priorities that India could perhaps build on or focus on, specifically as we've heard that India is planning on bidding for COP33, having it actually be hosted in Delhi or in India, wherever. So what do you think India can perhaps focus on at COP30 to consolidate its leadership, promote fairness, have more of these innovative forums, take more limelight, and kind of go forward with that? So, Tino, would you like to start?
Okay, a few quick ideas, just building also on what my colleague said, and ideas that will shift the needle. I think that's what we need to for. We can't think of incremental small changes for such a massive objective for global good. We need to find catalytic positions that we're going to really shift the entire system of action, financing, etc. One, and I'll do this in defense of the state. While I have argued for private sector engagement, I think, and these days, blame me, I'm a political scientist, I'm very worried about the state. I don't know if I'm in the right country, but I'm very worried about state capacity to deal with the churning and something that happens every 150 or 500 years, depending on how you want to look at it, which is a structural transition at any level. And if you look at any strategic foresight these days, these are the concerns. It's not about too much state, it's what type of state, how to rethink the entire state apparatus, technocracy, bureaucracy, representation, power of taxation, of imposition, even the monopoly of violence in many ways. Anyway, becoming too philosophical. Point number one, just to build on what Pooja was saying, it's phenomenal work that she's been doing on triangular, but it's also what kind of triangular, right? And you see the Indian state also reimagining what kind of triangular, not only public, PPP or GGG. This is now blended finance. It is in partnership with the private sector. I believe the UK-India triangular, right? Pooja, I learned from your study, is one where we have the SBI and private banks now involved. So there's increasing financialization of triangular from a private sector industry. So I think accelerating that, and I'm not sure where the thinking is here in India, Delhi, and whether that will be brought on the Indian position to Belém, Pooja. It'd be nice to monitor that, if that will happen or not. But that would be number one, I think, priority. Number two, Niranjan Rajadiksha has a great piece in the Mint in this week, where he's actually saying that, we need R&D and innovation, right, for climate action. I think we all agree. And when we think of R&D and innovation, we generally, and these days, look at the private sector, right, and make the appeal. I mean, Naushad Forbes, I think, was on a board member, keeps saying this year, has been in this room saying R&D, reform higher education, reform research and development in this country, budgetary account. I mean, whatever you can, throw money at it, because that's what the Chinese have done for 20, 30 years, and here India has not been able to do. And Niranjan's piece is interesting because he actually is quite pessimistic about it. He says the private sector, if you look at the historical record, has not done a good job in innovating. The great innovations have come from the state, which can afford to throw money at scientists and labs, etc., with the private sector. I'm not saying against the private sector, but to innovate, fail 99 times till you hit 100 times, to do something that is not path dependent, So on oil and gas, for example, he says, if you see innovations that have all come from the private sector, we're part dependent on oil and gas. If you're looking for innovations on climate-centric solutions, hydrogen, for example, you need to look, the state needs to be strong, to use my word, to invest in this and engineer the change towards the discovery. 2. 3, I mean, COP33 for what? Great, COP33 for reputation, for vanity, important things in IR, I agree, very important. And India's done a great job with G20. These are important reputational exercises also and learning exercises. But I think India can afford to go a little bit beyond the just merely reputational prestige status of we hosted a COP here, right here in Delhi. There needs to be substance to this COP, right? And we need capacity for that. And I'd say that there's 3 things that I'd like to see that are strategic beyond the tactical of COP. Belém is going to happen in 2 weeks. I mean, let's think big. Let's think 5, 10, 20 years from now. 3 things. One is recognizing that India suffers its capacity gap. Again, the study we do, the studies we've done show that on most accounts, if not all accounts of any international institution or framework, India is underrepresented in the rooms that matter. Happy to share the data, starting with COP delegation size and COP presence, whether it's government, civil society, research ecosystem, etc. Number 1, recognizing the capacity gap, but correcting that capacity gap with expert technocratic staff, research staff, etc., to be present in the rooms that will matter. There will be many more rooms. This will not be a one only room like a metaphoric saying COP was for 20 years. There are now 12, 15, 20 international rooms that will matter for climate action. India better be present there. India better have its voice there, which we know it has, but India also better have its capacity to mold and shape what happens in those rooms. 1. 2, at the Delhi level now. I went abroad, I'm coming home. Central level coordination. If ministries don't talk to each other, if they don't align on climate action, India's climate action will be severely limited. Again, happy to share data on this. On the left hand, not knowing what the right hand is doing, what Ministry 17 doesn't know what Ministry 23 is doing. Integration, and that's maybe the institutional designer in me, but is critical for action. And that means coordination, that means across the central state, I mean, a lot of more synergies. Last but not least, one level further down the step is state, cities, subnational. Okay, unless regional states play ball, unless they not only play ball because they're told to play ball, unless they're capacitated and given autonomy, for example, and I'll be very frank in our study with the DEA and the Ministry of Finance, I know these are center-state relations that are deeply entrenched and very important and constitutionally entrenched, but we need to rethink how to develop, delegate agency and capacity, here we go again, to regional state governments, cities, for example, in paradiplomacy, if you look at India's presence in the C40. So these are 3 things I'd like to see, and I think we have been arguing for in our studies, and you'll see more of these coming out, on how India can reimagine its climate diplomacy to empower itself, to be more capable to achieve the interests that are clear that India wants to achieve, and I think no one can question or deny. Thank you.
Thanks, Tinu. Veda?
Yeah, thanks, Anindita. I think you mentioned this, the trip to Zimbabwe. I should just mention it very quickly. So I had visited these lithium mining zones with 2 civil society organizations in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association and CNRG. And Zimbabwe is a country that has the potential to meet like 20% of the world's lithium demand, but currently meets only 1%. It's incredibly volatile, huge political, economic issues and so on. But one of the things that struck me when I was observing these discussions between these civil society groups and the mining communities and the local leaders and the local chiefs is how the ask was so low. You know, it wasn't huge asks from these mining communities. It's absolutely basic asks. And the fact that we visited Chinese mines, British mines, Australian mines, and the fact that this was not specific to a country, it was specific to the beast, mining, the nature of mining itself. So a lot of the discourse now is about how do we make sure that we don't repeat past mistakes. And there, the point that Pooja made about we can actually help and reimagine what alternative paradigms would look like. And one such paradigm would actually to hold our private sector accountable. India now has companies and SMEs that are actually trying to enter the mining markets and a lot of these emerging markets. How do we actually hold them accountable? How do we come up with a framework where if you're not able to hold them accountable at home, how do you do it abroad? The second is a lot of the countries, again, producer countries, the big problem is also geological mapping. They don't actually know how much reserves that they have. This comes up a lot again. How are you talking about a mineral-led industrialization when you don't know what minerals you have? So again, technical bodies that can be set up to very easily help map, survey, and assist these countries in building their capacities. And countries like Tanzania, for instance, India has a lot of frameworks in place when it comes to capacity building. We've set up the IIT Zanzibar right now, again, which is a very ambitious sort of mandate. So I think one big takeaway will be to build issue-based coalitions, use COP as a platform where you can actually build these networks and these channels where even post-COP, you actually take these wonderfully worded policy frameworks and try and think about how do we push it towards practice.
Thanks, Veda. Pooja, do you want to have the last word?
After all these wonderful comments, after all these amazing comments, I don't have that much to add, so I'll just be very brief. I mean, just two things. One, as I said, this proactive approach. I mean, India has been amazing at fighting, for CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. But I think it's time to move a little away from that. If you want to be a leader of the global south, then start showing that leadership in the sense of start saying, we are also innovators and creators of knowledge and tech. And as Tino said, also alternate financial mechanisms in which you can achieve your climate goals. So I think it's time for India to kind of as I said, not 100% veer away from its original stances, but start saying that, we are also there. We do also have things that we can contribute to the global south to learn from our ways and, the ways that we are doing things. As Tino said, COP30 shouldn't only be a vanity project for us. It should be a real way for us to say, hey, even the global south has tech knowledge and financial mechanisms which it can contribute into this. Now that we've reached the stage of implementation, we'll show you how you can do it, right? I think that really has to come out. And the second thing, and one thing that I feel is really missing, and which is so key to not only India but a lot of countries in the global south, is to just focus on the communities, because at the end of the day it is communities which are going to be affected. When you're talking about climate change, now that we've moved past from mitigation to the concept of loss and damage, adaptation and resilience, who is going to be affected? The communities. But they are not in the conversation anywhere, right? So I think COP30 is really a chance for India to also kind of highlight these grassroots movements which have taken place. I mean, barefoot, Seva, etc. Highlight your really, your grassroots initiatives, which are the communities, how are you dealing with that? And I think, knowledge and exchange platforms around these. And as I said, all this has to be hand in hand with the global north, right? Because, if this cannot be excluding them. So all of this approach also has to come with kind of the global north on board. And I think that's where now that as we shift from creating frameworks and ideas and consensus, and we move more into doing and how and kind of literally charting our climate futures, I think India can be more proactive as a player within that in COP30. And also, I don't know if you know, but India has already had a COP. So if we host this, it'll be India's second COP. I think it was 1992 or 1993, So I don't think India needs to host a COP just for the sake of hosting, because we already have. I really think it should be more impactful than that.
Thank you so much. I think we've had a pretty enriching discussion on how India can actually move from just talking to actually doing and actually live the whole sentiment of this being an implementation COP. So with that, I would like to open up the floor for questions. We'd like to take 3 at a go, if that's fine with the panelists, and you can address your questions.
Okay. I'm Lavish. I work with CSEP.
Yes, he's our president, so yeah.
I'd like to, it's not a question. I have a deep concern and actually almost bordering distressing thought. Why leadership? There is so much of leadership, India leadership. But what is the spirit behind this leadership? I think we have to be extremely careful about how we address this whole notion. I mean, the spirit of internationalism is about something different. It's not about leadership. So I think we may do all the right things, but what is the spirit behind it? And I think that's something that we need to be very careful about in our own framing of this. I mean, thinking for ourselves. I mean, while we are trying to address this issue. A lot of things have been said, amazing points, I feel. And I mean, I can repeat some of those, but the point I'd like to make is, if at all it is about a spirit of internationalism, then the first step is recognizing what are the challenges some of these other countries that we are interacting with are facing. And I think you made some points. I think Veda also did as well. But you need to start from there. What is the problem that we are trying to solve? Now, it may be that many countries have critical minerals, but they don't have processing abilities. We may not have those processing abilities, but then perhaps we can use our learnings from the triangular thing to bring others into the space. So we are trying to solve someone else's problem from that spirit. If we don't get that spirit right, then we will try to solve that problem ourselves to be there. So I think it's really important to get the spirit right in this.
Thank you. I think that's very important. So if there's any more questions, I think we can take a few. Yeah, please. Harshika, yeah. Please, you can also introduce yourselves.
Am I audible? Yeah. Great. I think my question just goes back. I'm Harshita from the Quantum Hub. I think my question goes forward a little to 2028 with COP33, something India will host. And we have had a lot of discussions in place on a climate finance architecture. The draft notification has been out, the GI targets have been notified. So it's, of course, a very fragmented landscape. How will that evolve over the next 3 years as we approach COP? But I think a more important question on communities that has come through. The question of gender justice within the just transition framework remains missing. Do we expect that the climate finance will also become gendered moving forward? And what is India's key take is going to be around it? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one more before going to the panel to answer. Is there any more questions on Professor Chadda, please?
I'm Rajesh Chadda. I work at CSEP. That's my introduction. I think it's fascinating trying three-pronged presentation, that what are the foreign policy issues, what are the issues of the critical minerals, and what are the issues on triangular cooperation that I started learning from your earlier presentations. So thank you. India's participation is important, but I think where I am a little not happy about is with US interest having declined, I fear that what happened to the WTO and trade disciplines that is at stake. So is there a way that we can, because after all, when we talk of climate fund, we talk of triangular cooperation, the funds used to come from somewhere, and if that channel gets closed, it is an important discussion to be had. The second point, you see, when we talk of the wheels that will move green technology, whether you have said critical minerals are going to be the fuels or wheels for greening all around. But I think it'll be very interesting to put forward three parts of the story together. One, countries that are extracting, countries that are processing, four parts actually. Countries that are not extracting, not processing, but depend on those critical minerals for their greening. Fourth, India. Countries that have critical minerals, but their policies are not in order, and so they will have different voices while discussing the greening of the global economy. So if some foreign policy fuel can be added to this, because we have been saying it in different ways, but I think it is very important because there is good. So I said there are four groups of countries that are going to be And for example, what is Congo's interest? After 2021, they have not given their NDC. So what will be their interest if they are not getting justice to the mining communities? And how can India champion the cause when India still has to do a lot of its homework on responsible mining? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think we can go in order of Lavish's comment. Tino, I feel like you may have something to add on the spirit of internationalization and how India can perhaps add more heft to the whole conversation of leadership.
I agree with that spirit. My spirit, I think it's absolutely spot on. I mean, leadership is maybe exactly, it's the wrong taxonomy you're using for a spirit of collective action, of cooperation, of learning, of listening. I mean, state capacity, sorry again, but if you're not able to assess what is required, context sensitive from other countries in the global south, I think India is deeply limited. And I'll be very frank here, and that's one of the ways that's exactly why Veda is sitting here in my team and building a phenomenal Africa team, right? The value we get from her trips over there, the work we do on South Asia, on Southeast Asia, the work we do on China now with Pooja allows us to understand even what the demands are. For that, you need deep, contextual, qualitative experience. It's called area studies in jargon, but we need people who know the language, who know the country, who have the trust, the inroads with those different geographies and sectors, to then also communicate and engineer substantive, serious dialogues that continue, not one quick G20 or one quick summit or one quick dialogue with Africa. I mean, what is Africa? Right? I mean, there's a variety there that Veda reminds us of that is often contradictory, in fact, on different positions. You talk to the Mauritians, they'll have a very different position on climate change than the Ethiopians. So I think there's that sensitivity is very important. On the climate finance, your point on gender, see, with Abhinav's permission, I'm going to quote exactly what he wrote down from his notes from what our study. And on the NGFS, for example, is a site for climate finance discussions, for example, right? Central banking discussions, taxonomies, norms, values, etc. The broader message is not about catching up for India on the NGFS, which it is doing now, but not just catch up in the way the NGFS was designed initially. So it's not only about catching up and buying into what exists, it's also about broadening the tent. India's late arrival is therefore also an opportunity to insist that future global standards on climate finance grow more representative, context sensitive, and development compatible, right? And I guess gender will find a place in that, right? That's a challenge for India in many ways to do this with the spirit of cooperation from its own perspective, I think from across the global south.
Yeah, I think Pooja, Veda, there are two more questions primarily, if you want to also answer the gender question and justice and how that's going to tie up on critical minerals and green transition and how different countries can portray themselves, and then on the similarity of the WTO and the decline with the US buyout and if that's going to impact COP.
Yeah, I mean, I can try to address some of the gender and the green taxonomy. So, I mean, I think when it comes to gender, I should say that and climate, I think India has looked at it from this perspective since the beginning. I mean, if you see a lot of work on the kind of agricultural resilience, there's a big gender aspect in that because, as we know, a disproportionate burden of agricultural work is done by women. If I'm not mistaken, I don't want to give you wrong information, but there's actually a specific institute that looks at climate change and gender. I think in New Delhi, it's actually it is a centrally sponsored institute that actually looks at the impacts of climate change on gender within the agricultural sector and food security. Even within the climate and health space, the gender aspect, is one of it. So I would say that maybe in mitigation, gender is a bit irrelevant to me, but I think when it comes to adaptation and resilience, I think gender will have. But also with mitigation, I won't say it's completely irrelevant. I'm sure, I mean, Veda can tell you more as well, but there has been these solar mamas, like trying to really promote women entrepreneurs who do mitigation work, in the rural stage. So I would actually say, surprisingly, India already has this gender lens. Even if you see the way our NAPCC is structured, I think the gender angle is is covered under the vertical. So I would say, and I think that will continue to be that way. I don't think gender is going to go out of the equation. I just think maybe it hasn't been spotlighted in the way I'm saying it. And maybe what needs to do then for COP is build in this narrative around all the initiatives which already exist and how gender is integrated into them. And then coming to the green taxonomy, I mean, Lavish and others are working more on that. I mean, we have Renu Kohli here who's actually working on the green taxonomy and her team. I mean, let's be honest, India doesn't have one right now, right? We're in the very, very initial stages. So where is it going to go? I mean, it has to go somewhere because unless India harmonizes its green taxonomy, I think you just sent me an article about how there's actually kind of some initiative within COP to do voluntary carbon markets and trades. Now, if India doesn't have its green taxonomy in order, how are you going to harmonize standards in order to do carbon trading, right? So it's something we have to do. I don't know why it's not happened more. Maybe you can talk to Renu Kohli, etc. I mean, we have just signed one of these landmarks agreement with Japan, I think a few months ago, where again, there was this voluntary carbon based. I spoke to the Japanese colleagues and they say MOFCC hasn't gotten back to us on how we're going to do this because they don't have the standards harmonized in order to start now carbon trading with Japan, right? So we are a late mover on that. But the thing is, we have to get our act together. And I hope sooner than later, the Indian government will, because if you see, China, for example, already has a very advanced green taxonomy. But yeah, maybe talking to some other key team leaders on why this hasn't happened yet. On Lavish's thing of spirit, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's what triangular cooperation or any kind of global south-south or global north has to be on the fact that we don't tell the world how to do it, but we work together with the world. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that COP India has always tended to be a bit passive, like insisting on these global north-south transfers instead of saying, you know what, we also have something that we can showcase. But again, in the spirit in which it's said or the spirit in which it's conveyed should come more as a bottom-up consensus approach as opposed to going around saying that we know everything and we can help you solve everything. Yeah, I mean, I think Tino should have actually taken the one on trade and the WTO, and I don't know much about those things.
No,
So
I have very different views from my colleague, which was why I love working at CSEP, that we have very different views among colleagues, right? That's one of the strengths of this place. And I have a different view from Rajesh. I think that I wouldn't beat that horse too much more. That's my view. I think it's not doing well. That was my first point on the MDBs as a function of multilateralism, but they're always in life limited resources and important objectives. It's an opportunity cost. My advice would be let's focus on what has the promise of working. In fact, that India has invested in beyond the multilateral, and I have to underline this. It's not that only, I mean, no, you meant in the way that not only talk, no action. India has had a huge, and again, our studies show this action in stretching the frontiers of our old imagination that the money can only come from one place or the climate connection can only come from the COP or the UN. No, India's been part of a change. And I have to say, has actually pushed others who used to be the pioneers on climate, including in the West, to think beyond it. And we heard a lot of bad things when we were writing these things 3 years ago, even 5 years ago. You guys are dismantling the system, adapting. No, I mean, right? I think the recipe of doing the same things when they don't work or the definition of that is madness, right? You can't. You have to think out of the box. It's going to be a tough time. It's not that multilaterals also will disappear or are useless. No, they play an important role. In fact, my first point on the COP is exactly that. And I think you gave even further, and you used coalition building. The platform like COP can play a very important role for coalition building, which it always used to play, and it can return to that. I think India should, focus on that. But these are different forms of multilateralism that we will see emerging. And the sooner we realize and comfortable in navigating and making the best out of that, I think the better we will be equipped for our respective country interests.
Yeah, I also want to just chime in and say, Lavish, that I do agree with your question. And I think especially when you're studying a continent like Africa with all of the colonial history that it has, one has to be very, very careful in wording the idea of like the one leader in the room, and definitely temper that, and also maybe say one of the leading voices in the global South, and all of that. But I am in 100% agreement about the spirit. Dr. Chadha, again, I agree with you. I think there's a deep irony, and I think it would be silly to not acknowledge the deep contradiction in these positions. But I think if we are waiting for India to set all of its affairs at home in order and make it perfect before we try to ideate internationally, that time may never come. So I think the idea is also to say, okay, there are niche areas where a lot of my colleagues have given granular examples, niche areas where we have succeeded, where we have been imaginative. How can we sort of power and turbocharge those? And then the question of what can India bring to the table, or what do these countries want from India? Again, there's such complexity in the question. Again, geography like Africa, the problem is that often it just gets brought together just as what does Africa want from India? If you ask, like Tino said, if you ask a Congo, if you ask an Ethiopia, you talk to Nigeria, the ask from India is often very, very different. And I think we have to be mindful of that as scholars. And this is something, again, the Chinese get right, because there are over 30 Africa study centers in China. And the inquiry and the granularity of scholarship, right? It's country specific, it's within country, subnational, substate. And here we are still talking about India's Africa strategy. So that's one of the things that we also need to talk about when we're talking about the global South as a classifier. Be very mindful and sensitive that the global South wants different things. What is the global South? And within the global South, Latin America is very complex, Africa is very complex. So I think while putting our positions on the table and coming up with ideas, being very sensitive to context is going to be increasingly important, while fully acknowledging the deep contradictions that exist. Many of these things that India is trying to do abroad, it has not been able to do successfully at home. And yet here we are trying to think that it is possible.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more round of questions. I think that, sir, at the back, if you could please get a mic, and then Shishir.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Volker Klima. I'm from the German Embassy. Maybe just to add Africa. In Africa, you have now, since last year, before COP, climate COP, you always have an African climate summit. So actually now even African Union becomes very strong. Maybe first question could be in how far India cooperates, works with the African Union, because now they are stepping in. Second question, when it comes to India, BRICS. Next year, India's got its BRICS presidency. And now we have the G77 plus China group, and India is in it. So it's going to be in Brazil. So who speaks kind of on behalf of the global South? Will it be Brazil? Will it be China? Will it be India? What role may India play in the BRICS community? And maybe now the third question, sorry. With what goal, objective, India goes to Brazil? Climate always has a political layer objective, and it has a operational objective. On which matter India will focus more? To send political messages or to get climate mitigation adaptation run on operational level? Thank you.
Thank you, Shishir.
Thank you, guys. So I am using this as a opportunity to learn 101 on this, because my understanding of COP is the issue is money, 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 which is climate finance. But what are other 3, 4, 5 key priorities that India has? I am unaware. So any thoughts on that would be appreciated.
One more question I think we can take if there's any on the floor. Otherwise, we'll move. Oh, Utkarsh.
What can India learn from other countries of the global South?
Okay, so I think there's like 5, 6 questions. Whoever would like to go ahead, I think the panelists can take it. There is one on priorities at COP beyond climate finance. What can India learn from other countries? Veda, I think you would be the best position to answer the African Union Climate Summit, how India works with AU. and how that can go forward? And then what are the priorities, who will lead the Global South bloc at other forums when India has its BRICS presidency, the G77 plus China group, and who is going to be the spokesperson, how India can do something more? So.
Just quick answers. I think, again, what can India learn from countries in the Global South? It really depends on the country. I think, for instance, in South Africa has a very vibrant Center for India Studies, which does a lot of work on trying to find sectors of alignment where South Africa has been very successful in, and can take a lot of those lessons that have been successful in South Africa to specific Indian contexts. The African Union is very interesting because India has traditionally bilaterally dealt with African countries. As you know, we followed the Banjul formula until a few years ago. And then the tracks of communication started with the regional blocs, and the African Union emerging as a very key player in this is very important, and it's actually opened a whole new track of communication. As you know, now the India-Africa Forum Summit, which is supposed to happen now in 2026, is with the African Union. But CSEP particularly is very uniquely positioned to leverage this relationship because we have a partnership with the African Union Development Agency, and we're very much in conversations with them as we try to build our Africa vertical here, because we're very aware of the fact that we are not going to be sitting in New Delhi and writing about what's happening in Kenya. So the African Union then helps and acts as a bridge to connect us to scholars and researchers and think tanks in the continent, and as we try and figure out our areas of priority when it comes to research. But more nationally, I think while India plans the next India-Africa Forum Summit, the African Union becomes a very key actor.
Pooja, would you like to go next, and also maybe perhaps the operational versus
Yeah, I think I'm going to go next and answer the easy ones and leave all the hard ones for Tino on BRICS and the bigger, larger questions. I'll start with the Shashir. So, I mean, finance has actually become a thorny subject, I think, more recently. If you see the early COPs, they were all around frameworks of understanding really how countries need to come together and work. I mean, first it was proving the scientific evidence of climate change. So that's where the IPCC came up. So you have your models, which is also under the UNFCCC. I mean, so the annual IPCC reports are under this UNFCCC. So, I mean, a lot of it was about scientists and, grassroots levels actually coming together and working on understanding what is climate change, how is it going to affect us, and kind of what should be the future pathways of getting there. So that is why we're saying now we've gone from a frameworks approach to a more implementation approach. So COP, I think the financial aspect has become, I think, would say mainly post Paris is when it became, more like aggressive around that. Like earlier, it was as Veda said, around coalition building, around issue building, and that is why India actually was very active in the COPs in the previous time, because it was a way to kind of go along with our kind of global South solidarity approach. Like we would often build coalitions with global South groups within COP, and that was a venue for us to do that. So, like as Lavish said, that was the spirit of leadership which India was taking within COP, to really become this coalition builder, to kind of put forward evidence and to kind of push the global North a bit, being like, these are actually issues that we perceive in different way than you do. So bringing in the aspects of climate justice, bringing in the aspects of historical emissions, all of that has happened in COP. So the fact that it's become, I'm sad to hear that it's become distilled into, it's just about arguments around money, because actually that's not what COP has stood for at all. It is also a forum where global South countries have been able to have a voice, I think, comparatively to WTO, etc., where maybe a country, a small island nation or a large island state within this whole trade conversation, it's insignificant. But within COP, it actually has legitimate arguments to maybe, to state. So I think, that is how I see COP. Maybe I'm being very idealistic because I come from the climate background. But, so COP stands for so much more for us. And I think then after Paris, it became more about also engaging non-state actors. So a lot of subnational, you have this mayors group, these mayors around the world. You have these, a lot of We Mean Business. So a lot of other coalitions also started of non-state actors started to build. So I think, that's what COP has been about. I think to answer the German colleague, I think it is, so I mean, even though it's very ironic and something I don't think the Indian government would say at COP, but even though India keeps saying we need more finance, most of our mitigation and adaptation finance comes from within. We are not dependent on international finance and never have been to push either our mitigation or adaptation strategy. But I think, as I was telling Shashi, like the reason we do that is it's a political messaging. We are making a point that climate justice, we need to take that forward. So we don't really honestly need the money. I think 90% of our funding for mitigation comes from private, from the domestic sources. And I think similarly, 90% of our adaptation funding comes from public domestic houses. So it is going to be more about political messaging. I think even in the operationalization aspect, it's going to be more about the political messaging, because I think it is mainly, I mean, if like I just did actually a mapping of the main actors within the climate governance, and you don't really see, unfortunately or fortunately, MDBs or international organizations playing that bigger role in actually governing how India operates. I wish they would play a bigger role, but they currently don't play that bigger role in actually how India is governing its climate strategy. So that's an answer to that. Anything?
What India can learn from?
Oh yeah, what India can learn. I mean, I think India can learn a lot from other countries. I think, I mean, we just see our neighbor China has way far advanced in, I mean, in a techno state, in manufacturing, in even if you see their urban resilience, their spun cities, we have a lot to learn from other countries. I would not say that, as I was saying earlier, we cannot say that we can have it all, that we know it all. We have a lot to learn, especially from other large emerging economies. But I think there are also, I mean, I think it was during one of our roundtables that it came out that, there are even, like if we see a lot of the grassroots activity happening in Africa, the digitalization of services, especially in the green space, like, like if you have solar panels and, all the digitalization of these kind of payment mechanisms and stuff. So we have a lot to learn in terms of resilience, as well as I think some of the larger kind of macroeconomic green transitions that we have to make. We have a lot to learn. I don't know whether that learning will come in COP. I feel that it, as Tino said, it will happen in smaller groupings. I think COP is a way to build coalitions and then take those coalitions and then, separately have those conversations. I think COP is more about building those venues for messaging and coalition building.
Yeah, thanks, Veda. And with that, Tina, I would like to pass on
Yeah,
to you for the last
right. I mean, on Belém, I think political operational, my bet is clearly on operational. I think there's a political voice of India that will continue. But if you read the room of Baku, I was not there, but I saw the images, the audio. These are important things in diplomacy. And you read the room that I expect to happen in Belém. India's voice was more shrill in Baku for many reasons. Late Biden trying to push through a lot of stuff still under the administration that was already outgoing. And India, obviously, in the mode that was classified as many, including by some of your colleagues in Germany, as defensive, aggressive, etc. I think the political will take a back step. It'll be there as usual. But the operational, the cruise mode, and a more comfortable India walking into the room saying, okay, we're not under pressure, which is when India performs the best multilaterally, not at home, but multilaterally, that's my body language or diplomatic language or posturing, I bet. But who knows? Let's see what happens over the next 3 weeks. 2, what were the priorities? I think actually we shared so much already in this discussion. I was just thinking, amazing. I mean, so many predictions of what India will do in a changed COP. Local, right? Subnational. I think that was all over your point, Pooja, right? I mean, the communities, the subnational coalition building, information and data exchange. I think that will take a stronger push. And then also like experimental. I said it in my opening remarks. I think the COP will be a great place for experimenting, sharing experiments and new small initiatives. And I know it's not as nice as a big consensus, 1.5, 0 point this, 3 billions here. But I think there's something to small is beautiful, small, that there is a role for the COP to showcase smaller groupings will come up with their lessons, with their experiences and their learnings and showcase them and share them. And there will be natural buy-in from other partners. I'm thinking of the methane initiative, for example, on the forest initiative, the Brazilians are pushing on with significant investments already, including from Europe. So maybe those will be more priorities, I think, for India. And finally, development. Sorry to end on that note, but no, I was thinking, I don't know if you saw the Bill Gates discussion this last week, right? And this major uproar that his study and statement and posture has, I think, created in the climate space over the last 2 weeks. But I mean, when I read Bill Gates, I'm reading Indira Gandhi, 1972 Stockholm UN Conference on Human Environment, where she said, our policy is one where by eradicating poverty, we will eradicate pollution and harm to the environment. That was a statement. It was revolutionary. It was seen as socialist or negative or third worldist at that point. I mean, the more I look back at this and the more I hear it even from any other sub-prime minister since then, including the current prime minister, and now I hear Bill Gates from the Gates Foundation saying this, I'm like, wait, maybe there is something here that will persist and elevate the nexus between environment and what world do we want to live in from a developmental perspective, right? And there, of course, there'll be differences between Sweden and India, between Canada and India, between Japan and India. There will be differences. But 2 last points on BRICS. I think, Delhi is in a BRICS mode as it was in a G20 mode, and it was a very painful mode for us think tanks because it's just like G20, G20, G20 every 2 weeks an event. And then now we're asking ourselves what came out of it. It's a mixed bag, but it's certainly not as amazing as the resources we put into a bazillion discussions and policy briefs and whatever events. I'd say also I'd be a bit cautious on BRICS, therefore. It's something India has to do. It's not something India chose to do. It fell into India's calendar for next year. For many geopolitical reasons, it's a tough one. India will put in maximum effort into it. But why it matters for climate, if you look at energy, sanctions, and financial diversification, that affects climate. If you're talking BRICS about de-dollarization or alternative banking settlements, you automatically close certain doors within the NGFS and other systems that India is part of. So there are choices that India will have to make on energy and climate within the BRICS. Sorry, non-energy, non-climate choices in the BRICS that will affect its energy and climate policies and partnerships with the non-BRICS camp, non-Russia, non-China in this case, and you as a European, I'm sure will appreciate the importance of that. Last, who speaks for the Global South? I think Veda replied. I think if you are expecting one voice, good luck. You will not get it. The point I made about country expertise in India applies also for the West and the North. You will also have to invest in listening to the new voices, the new knowledge that is being built in the Global South. You've done it for a long time, but if I was going to give a recommendation also to our friends in Europe, the US is hopeless at this point, is the more you listen, we're talking about this also, what the innovations are, the learnings, and the more you transmit them back home to your respective countries, that capacity will allow you to bring the plurality of voices from across the Global South to inform your own decisions for the next 10, 20 years. Thank you.
With that, I think we're at time. We're just a few minutes beyond 5:30, so I think this is ended on a really good note. So I would like to thank everybody for having joined us for this discussion, and I hope everybody continues to follow what happens in the coming few weeks at COP, and then perhaps we can see what goes on, how much of it was in line with everything we had and how much was not. So I would like to invite everybody to join us for tea outside. There's some tea and snacks, so please be welcome. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.